Today we're talking about the Crusher. The Crusher was changed in Season 5, had a little bit of an adjustment in a different direction from what it was before. Crusher has seen many different passives, especially throughout the last years. The new one is coming with a little description from Hi-Rez. The Crusher has a unique stat spread that helps it work well with ability-based hunters and a few assassins, but the passive limited who could successfully use it. Bluestone's passive is being moved to this item and being amped up, giving guards who previously liked the Crusher a passive that is more impactful. New passive. Your abilities deal bonus damage over time equal to 30 plus 15 of your physical power over 2 seconds. Just to make this 100% clear, because I initially misread it as well, this means it deals 30 plus 15% damage. Not 2 ticks of that, it's just 30 plus 15% of your physical power and that's it. It just takes a while to tick that much. 2 seconds is still a little bit in the bigger picture of things in the middle of a fight. The interesting and unique thing about Bluestone was the early extra damage, which was basically a kind of independent base damage value, and that's what made it so highly valued. Now the Crusher is not really the same thing, as you will still have a relatively low base damage considering the price, and then the more important part is the rest of it is the scaling, at least later into the game. In order to see how good the Crusher really is in comparison to other items, we'll pull out some different items and see the impact. The build that we'll be using here first is Fenrir with Assassin's Blessing, Warrior Tabi, and Transcendence. The target is a level 15 Arachne, so a decent amount of protections at that point. Level 15 I felt was reasonable in regards to the amount of items that you have. Transcendence because it's actually decent in early as well as late game now, and it can be used by both assassins and hunters to a certain degree, so something that doesn't interfere with the penetration any further as well, which could kind of bias the results a little bit here, skew the results in one direction or the other. To that combination of items I added a Nothing, just to see what the base value without it would be, then the Crusher, then Brawler's Beatstick, and then Heartseeker. That way we have a decent selection of different penetration items that in some parts have additional effects and some don't. In order to understand the different functionality or paint the different functionality of the items better, I used a different combination of abilities and the passives. First, I used the 1 plus all the passives of the abilities, meaning either the Crusher passive or the Heartseeker passive. And then I used a combination of the 1, the 3, 2 basic attacks, and the corresponding passives. These two different combinations on Fenrir specifically show very different examples of how items and abilities can interact. In one case, we just have one ability that scales with 80% and will only deal 1 instance of damage, but it can still proc something like Heartseeker. In the other case, you also have an ability that scales up to 200%, so it will be a lot more dependent on the power and therefore change the picture a little bit. A little reminder regarding the stats. Brawler's Beatstick has 40 physical power and 15 penetration, while the Crusher only has 30 physical power, but the same 15 penetration, but also comes with 20% attack speed on top of that. Heartseeker, on the other hand, also has the 30 physical power that the Crusher has. On top of that, has 10 physical penetration, and in addition to that, comes with 10% movement speed. We've already talked about the Crusher's passive. In Heartseeker's case, the passive is every successful basic attack gives you 1 stack. At 5 stacks, your next ability deals bonus damage equal to 100% of your physical power to the first enemy guard hit. So even if you were to hit 4 abilities with the Crusher, you'd only get up to 60% scaling. So if you have more power, Heartseeker will deal more in comparison. But at the same time, you get 120 flat damage with the Crusher on top, which especially factors in when we're talking about penetration-focused builds. In our particular example, we haven't really maxed out the power yet because we're kind of in the middle stages of the game. And if we go deeper into the game, further into the game, then we'll probably see a little bit of a spike for Heartseeker just because the power scaling goes up higher and you probably build a fair bit more power, but it shouldn't be overwhelmingly different from the picture we're seeing at this point. So at this point, the damage values for the 1 start from 335 with Heartseeker up to 354 with Brawler's Beatstick. The differences here are relatively minor, only 19 damage difference between the weakest and the strongest. When we look at Fenrir's 3, Brutalize, hitting all 4 hits, then Heartseeker deals 708 damage, Crusher sits in the middle with 736, while Brawlers goes up to 752 damage. So a little bit more of a damage difference here, up to 44. Nothing too crazy yet, but definitely impactful. With the basic attacks, the difference is a fair bit smaller. Heartseeker starts at 168, and then Crusher comes in at 174, Brawlers at 182. But what about the combos? If we look at the combo of the one and the passive, then the first one is Crusher. Crusher will deal 388 damage. That is once the 1 plus 1 time the ticking passive. With Brawlers, it's 354. That's just the raw damage, nothing else added on top. With Heartseeker, it's 450 damage. This should be very obvious. If you have Heartseeker's passive up, which you should before pretty much any engage, then you will get this massive amount of extra damage on the initial ability. And this is going to be important later, we'll get back to that. But first, let's look at the other combo, the 1 plus 3 plus 2 basics and the passives. In the case of Brawler's Beatstick, that's the lowest value in this case, that's 1470 damage. It's still not too far off the other damage values. With Heartseeker, it's 1494 damage, so 24 damage more. With the Crusher, it's 1512 damage, so we're adding an extra 18 damage here. Overall, I think these damage values are much closer than I personally expected. Now at the same time, we have to say that this doesn't exactly favor Crusher, as we're only using 2 damaging abilities on Fenrir, excluding the ultimate. A god with 3 damaging abilities would favor the Crusher a little bit more here, as you would get an additional tick and additional 40 extra damage in the combo. But generally, I think it's important to be aware that these damage values are not that far apart. All 3 of these items bring unique effects. In Crusher's case, that's the extra attack speed, in Brawler's case, that's the anti-heal, and in Heartseeker's case, that's the extra movement speed. As such, I think all items will have their niche. If the enemy has healing, then Brawlers should be a no-brainer. Often enough, you will have to build Brawlers to counter the enemy team effectively. And when that's the case, you shouldn't even have to consider if you're building Heartseeker or Crusher. You should just go straight into Brawlers because that's what your team needs and that's what will win you the game. You're not looking at optimized, maximized DPS or damage here. You just want to make sure that the enemy doesn't heal the entire team. With Heartseeker, it's more about getting in and getting out, dealing as much damage as possible in a very short amount of time. For example, excluding the point that Thanatos doesn't necessarily need to build interpenetration, on Thanatos, if I was to choose between any of these items, I would probably go with Heartseeker when I don't need Brawlers, simply because it gives a little bit more movement speed and his mobility is kind of lacking as he only has a movement speed ability and not really a leap or something like that in his kit. And he also goes in, tries to deal as much damage as possible, as quickly as possible, and he will expect his enemy to probably use their Aegis relatively quickly if they ever get focused down, and as such, the damage should be through before that's happening. It's very unlikely that you will wait around or wait for Crusher ticks to proc in order to kill your enemy or use an excessive amount of basic attacks, so I think that is a character where Heartseeker would be highly preferred. Daji, on the other hand, kind of spams her abilities when going into a fight and has more damaging abilities that she can use quite often, and as such can make better use of the Crusher or even hit it on multiple targets with her ultimate. And also she kind of revolves her own dots, so she will have to expect the enemies either using the Aegis to survive or just dying to the dots later after getting out the fight anyways. So with her, I think it's a great item to have, and I would probably usually prefer it over Heartseeker, though not always. You can also combine both items, but that's not necessarily always the greatest choice, as both items come with 30 power each, which isn't the highest power value, and as both scale with your power, the more power you have, the more damage they will deal, and you can get other items that kind of increase their scaling better. It's still not a terrible choice, but not always ideal. On Hunters, on the other hand, I think this item will become a lot more dominant going into the next patch. With crit being nerfed, I see a lot more room for Crusher in certain Hunter builds, especially those who are a little bit ability based. Think those who have more abilities that they can frequently use, like Ullr or even a Medusa that just generally makes use of a little bit more clearing power through abilities as well. An early Crusher can do wonders there. Definitely not a first item choice, you still want to get your Transcendence or your Devils, but a little bit later into the build, maybe before some lifesteal or after, it can be a great addition. At the same time, always keep in mind that ability-based hunters can also build in a Brawler's Beatstick, and in some situations that will be necessary, so that is nothing that should be ignored at any point. Due to its attack speed, even if hunters were able to build Heartseeker, which they aren't, they would still make a lot more use out of Crusher, because DPS-wise it will definitely come out on top. At the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that all of these items, Crusher, Brawlers and Heartseeker, will often have similar damage values. The difference will not be insane unless we talk about very long-term DPS in a trade. And that should be the main takeaway from this video. Build corresponding to what your build requires, what you need to counter, and how the enemies are countering you. If you see 5 Aegis and you're an assassin, then maybe consider Heartseeker, just because otherwise you won't do much with the bleed. If you see a lot of heals, build Brawlers. If you see neither, then consider Crusher. And with that, thank you guys for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Dukesloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.